the clouds. We have it for later. Got about 30 seconds left and we'll get rolling. Yeah, your bread, I'm a serious bread snob, like serious bread snob, and your bread passed my tests. So
that's good.
pretty fantastic. More folks are rolling in here. The countdown. I feel like there needs to be like music playing or something. Or you and I need to be eating something while they're like zooming in.
If you're not eating something now, you'll be eating something after.
Oh, absolutely. All right, it is 7:05. I'm going to get this started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Kelly Fonto-Dietz. I'm the Director of Programming, Education, and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall. And this is one of our wonderful programs in this series on colonial culture and foodways. And we are here tonight with Justin Cherry, who has become a friend of mine. And he'll be talking about some pretty amazing things, including waffle frolics, which we'll get into later. But this series tonight is brought to you by the very generous funding from the Virginia Foundation for Humanities, or Virginia Humanities as they're called themselves now. And we are honored to have Justin Cherry here to talk about colonial foodways in the 18th century and to do a cooking demonstration, which we filmed when it was hot. So for those of you that are missing summer, we have a little bit of blazing heat here for you in a minute that we're going to show you. But it's a really exciting program series that we're doing, and thank you all for zooming in. And welcome, Justin. Welcome back to virtual Stratford Hall. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me back again, and thank the folks at Stratford and Virginia Humanities for letting me do what I do, because it's a great pleasure to do.
We loved having you at Stratford Hall. And just so you know, you're going to be a long-term friend of ours because we want that oven to come back. So some of you might have seen Justin early in the year. So he actually kicked off the series, which started on, what was it? It was actually supposed to be August 12th, and there was the thunderstorm, so we had to postpone it. But, this started when the summer was blazing and it was, before the fall, and we're sitting here sort of leaning into the holidays and into winter. It's a very different time of year. And I wanted to kick it off with Justin, as well as Steve Bayshore, who was with you in that first program, to kind of set the stage for this larger series that we're doing on colonial foodways. And, the first program was all about milling and our mill at Stratford Hall, which is phenomenal. And it was a really nice way to kick it off. We've since had Dontavius Williams come back and do African-American foodways, and Nancy Siegel do stuff about colonial women and cakes, and Justin doing his charismatic programs on maps, etc. And it's really nice to have you come back in and kind of take us home, right? So we have a couple more programs in the series. We have you here tonight, and I purposely scheduled you here tonight, Justin, and to all of you that are listening, purposely scheduled you for this really dynamic program tonight to highlight some of the foods that you'd be cooking, right, in the 18th century, and some of the wonderful foods that you've pulled from the archive, pulled from Richard Henry Lee's memorandum book, and that you bake in that oven. And it's a wonderful way, I think, to kick off our national food holiday of Thanksgiving. And so I've scheduled you right smack dab in the beginning of Thanksgiving week. So it's nice to have you back. And yeah, I can't wait to have you back to Stratford again.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to bring my oven there and set it up right next to the mill and have freshly milled grains go from basically mill to oven within about 2.5 hours, which most people don't see. And, new crop flour that's ground like that soft white winter wheat, the white Lamasse, it just tastes so good. You can taste the grain, and, even in the waffles and the flannels that we'll talk about later, those things, really bring forth the grain and really bring forth that great flavor that it has. So I'm really excited for folks to see this. And
I can't wait. I can't wait to watch the video again. Although I'm a little sad that it's been months since I've eaten the food. So I'm gonna play a video for all of y'all. I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna play the video of Justin cooking some really beautiful food. And yeah, we'll talk about that beautiful food afterwards and how you made it and what's behind it and all those things. But you do serious wonders with your big oven. I have to say, it's a phenomenal thing to watch you work with.
Thanks.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bear with me. I think I have this all down by now. If I don't, I'm in trouble. So let me get you guys ready. I'm going to share the screen. Oops, hold on one second here. I'm going to make sure I do this correctly this time. Share screen, share computer sound. Very important. I am recording this for those of you that have to leave early. All right, here. Share. And here we go. All right, everyone. Sit back and enjoy 7 minutes and 11 seconds of Justin Cherry working his magic.
All right, here we are at Stratford Hall in front of a 18th century clay oven. And what we're making today is rice waffles. These waffles were popular in the colonial South, from Southern Virginia down into the Carolinas where rice was prominent. And we have a batter here, and it's made up of eggs and some beer barm, which is an early type of yeast. And there's cooked rice in here as well as rice flour, and then also some soft winter wheat, which was grown here at Stratford. So we'll slowly pull out this waffle iron. It works like scissors. And you can see it's piping hot. And the batter's a little bit more thick than modern day. You can hear the sizzle. Close her up. And we'll get it right over those hot coals. Now what we want is that nice golden brown. And we've shoveled coals underneath an iron plate so it can sit right on top. And all the sugars, natural sugars and yeast will come out and it'll caramelize the top of that waffle. It'll be thick and crusty on the outside and nice and moist on the inside. All right, looks like our waffle's done. These irons get so hot they heat up for about 20 or 30 minutes prior to. Look at that waffle. The colors come out so nice with that rice. Set it right here. Let's get a little nice butter and lard mixture right on top of that. And typically these were eaten even as early as the 17th century, all the way up in New York. The Dutch brought the irons and they had waffle frolics, basically parties for people to enjoy waffles and eat them with butter and sometimes fine sugar. All right, we're making breakfast cakes. This appeared in the Richard Henry Lee memorandum book in 1784, along with a few other recipes. And they were also called flannels. And it's sort of a crumpet, biscuit, early pancake form, but it's made with yeast. And we've made the dough here, and we have it rising, and cut it out or form it, and then it gets fried just like an English muffin. We're gonna scoop it and put it on this tin baking tray, and it's an enriched dough. It's made with eggs and butter and flour to make that little thick dough. Slide it in a little bit, and then we'll wait about 2-3 minutes until it's done. All right, here we are. That looks properly risen and caramelized on top. We're gonna brush it with a little bit more butter. And then kind of working a little bit. I got some wonderful apple butter from Virginia apples. And this recipe is from Richard Henry Lee's memorandum book in 1784, made from Virginia apples. And that'll go nicely with any breakfast. All right, we're back again making some apple tansy. This recipe comes from 1742, Eliza Smith. It was also published in London first, and then it was reprinted and published in Williamsburg. And this is a great egg dish. A lot of people think of apple tansy. They're like, oh, it's a great apple dish. This is a great egg dish. It's eggs and cream and spices like nutmeg and mace and a little bit of lemon zest. We're going to start by frying up some apples. I recommend a heritage breed of apple. If you can get your hands on some Pippins or Hughes crab apples, they work great. Even dried apples, rehydrated, maybe in a little brandy. But we're going to fry these for about 2 or 3 minutes. All right, the apples have fried. And now we're going to put in our egg cream mixture. And we're going to add a little bit of spice to this too. We're going to add some nutmeg. We're going to add some mace. A little bit of lemon zest. A little bit of sugar. All right, we're going to pour that egg cream mixture with all those spices right over top. And let those apples sort of coat inner layer in between the eggs. And then we're going to put that back in the oven for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then it'll be done. All right, looks like everything's set up real nicely in this pan. The cream and egg mixture has set the apples in place. Next, we'll garnish it with a little bit of lemon zest. A little more. A little squeeze of a lemon. And then just a little bit of sugar. Now it's ready to enjoy. All right, here we are, and we have a beautiful table set here at Stratford Hall. And we have our waffles that we made, our breakfast cakes or flannels with apple butter. We have our wonderful apple tansy, sprinkled with sugar and lemon zest. And we have another specialty of Virginia, the ham, smoked and cured, along with some English cheddar. We also have here our apple butter. And these are to complement this whole meal, what they would call a feast. Let's enjoy.
That would help. Hey, now I'm hungry. Thanks, Justin. So that was a beautiful 7 minutes and 11 seconds. And before we get to some of the questions and answer from the Q&A from the audience, I want to have a conversation with you as a fellow food historian. And, I don't even consider myself a food historian necessarily. I'm a historian and I was a professional chef and all those things, but I just have some questions. Like, for instance, like what got you into doing this historical foodways? Like what brought you into doing these historical recipes to build that oven? I mean, tell me your path to where you got to this point.
I did living history as a kid with my family.
Okay.
At the age of 4, we've done living history, both French and Indian War and American Revolution. And we still do it. My wife does it. My 3-year-old daughter does it. And that sort of got me quite interested in just the historical aspect of everything. And then when I went into professional kitchens, I worked in kitchens for 13, 14 years. And I worked under like Sean Brock. I helped open up Husk in Charleston and a few other restaurants underneath that flagship. But that really got me interested in, historical food and grains and where everything came from. And can we get those grains and can we get those same peas that people use and the same vegetables And then I started putting two and two together. And I really wanted to make bread the way they used to make bread. So I started out with Anson Mills, a good relationship with Glenn Roberts. And, we talk every other week still to this day about, things on the rise and what they're trying to bring back and what they've already brought back, what I haven't used, where every origin of the wheat comes from. And all those things sort of put together really, really fueled like, oh man, I got to do this, but I don't know how to do this inside of a restaurant. You can do that and you can only take it so far, but people have, they have modern taste. They have modern taste buds, and not everything specifically like tasted awesome back then. So we use, our palates today, and we make things taste good, knowing what we know and using things of historical aspects. So I thought, how can I do this outside of the restaurant? And I already started doing a bread program at Husk using heritage grains and baking bread on Sundays before brunch service. And I go into the restaurant at 3:30, 4 a.m. and clean out the oven and sweep it and mop it and make, 8, 10 loaves of bread, and we'd run it for brunch. And that was, exciting, but it wasn't really the full aspect of it. And I really I wanted to get back into the living history part and the education part. And I said, how can I make this like a viable business to get myself out of the kitchen and really spend some more time with my family, not at home, but maybe traveling on the road. And, I said, hey, maybe I can make one of these ovens and maybe somebody can put it on a trailer. I didn't really know where I was going with it.
Make it so big that you have to haul it around in a truck, right?
It's like the biggest. I had to choose like the biggest kind of oven possible to tow behind my truck. But I was doing research for Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills about some grain in Georgia, and I ran across. He's like, yeah, these guys, this group of people in Georgia, the settlement, they were known as like the best bakers in the South.
Okay.
And a group of German Lutherans that had been sponsored by England to come over and set up a little settlement just northwest of Savannah.
Oh.
Early 1730s, like 1734. So just after like Oglethorpe and all of them came through. And I said, oh, I never heard about that. And now I was like intrigued. And he said, yeah, you need to go down there. They have like a research library, because they actually wrote back, because they were sponsored by England. They had to report weekly, what was happening, what was going on. So, they're dropping names of grains, and they're talking about building grist mills. And they built the first grist mill in Georgia in 1740. And they also built a series of ovens for the settlement itself, for the community, to bake bread in. And that's where the design from my oven came from. Somebody in the 19th century described finding one of the old ovens from the settlement, kind of washed away a little bit because it was so close to the Savannah River, but enough that they actually detailed pretty much in description how deep it was, how wide it was, what the bottom was made of. And
Perfect for you.
It's weird because I found it after I already started the design of my oven, and it kind of nailed it right on. I was only off by like a half foot in width and depth.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. And for those of you saw the scale because he was standing next to it, but that thing is a beast. I mean, the inside of it is pretty large. What's you told me at one point when we were talking preliminarily about you coming to Stratford and doing these programs that you've put a whole like half a lamb in there. Is that correct?
Yeah, we put a whole lamb in there.
A whole lamb. Okay.
Yeah, it was a 120-pound lamb.
So next time you come to Stratford, I'm a huge lamb fan. Huge. So I think next time you come, we can break away from the whole baking thing and get into the meat. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
That's so awesome.
Not too long ago, last month, I roasted like a whole hind quarter of a deer that I'd shot like 3 days before that. It was It was pretty great. It was in between baking. So it was like,
Oh, just in between the beautiful bread, you're just gonna throw a little venison in the oven. So I see how you roll, Justin. I see you. I see you.
so, but yeah, the it's about 5 foot deep and about 4.5 foot wide.
Okay,
Just to,
so it's actually, yeah, it's bigger than I even remember it being. That's
just to put that
amazing.
in the scale, because it
Yeah.
actually doesn't look quite that big, just because the walls are about 1.5 to 2 foot thick.
Okay.
So
And
it
before
does,
we get into the Q&A, I just one more question because seeing this oven is so fascinating to me. So you literally took local clay from South Carolina and sand and just kind of layered it? Like, is there a wire in there? Like, how did you get the actual oven built?
yeah. So traditionally, you would build saplings, um, or you'd pile sand. But saplings were more a little traditional. You pile saplings, and then you'd combine mud and clay, a little bit of like lime and salt,
Okay.
and you'd put whatever really was available. Most of the time, it was wheat straw, but considering where I'm at, it's rice straw.
Makes
And
sense. Yeah.
rice straw as well. And that's kind of piled on top until it starts to dry out, and then you burn the saplings out,
Okay.
starting a series of miniature
And then
fires.
as the clay fires, it gets more firm, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and it sets it.
That's
So
awesome.
you know now modern day, like mine, and since I travel with it quite a bit, it's actually a form, a mold, and then there's 1.5 to 2 feet of clay, mortar, and lime mixture on top of that.
Nice. Okay.
Something just to make it stable, because most of them did have roofs on top of them, because it would just wash away if it was
Yeah.
beaten down with weather so
That
often.
makes sense. That makes sense. Well, we've got a slew of questions here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I know I saw a couple of them. So the recipes that you saw, just beautifully made by Justin Cherry, we'll get those out in the email to you in the next couple of days. You'll be able to recreate those things. Didn't want to sort of muddy the video with that. So everybody that signed up will get a copy of the recipes that he used for those particular dishes. So we'll jump right in here. Doreen asks, Justin, what kind of brush did you use to apply the butter to the waffles? It looked like feathers. Those waffles, by the way, for those of you that haven't eaten a rice waffle or Justin's waffles, they were amazing. But go ahead.
So yeah, it's a great question. So the brush it did look like feathers because it was in fact feathers, goose feathers to be exact. That was a big practice in the 17th and 18th and even 19th century, to use goose feathers wound together. And because it just adapted the fat a little bit better, more than commonly they would use like brushes and young twigs and that for like a whisk. So the goose feathers, you can't really find that often, which it so happens that that's from my wife's family, who she's from Slovakia, and they carry some old heirloom things with them, because I haven't been able to find any other brushes like that anywhere, at least in the States anyways. But yeah, they were quite common, and they're great to apply butter and fat with.
Awesome. There was another question about that. So I think Sarah got her question answered as well. Here's a question from Judy. It is my understanding that common practice was to age flour after it was milled. I'm not sure why. Would making a product like breakfast flannels really have been made with freshly milled grains? Just curious.
Yeah, so usually, later on in the 19th century, you would see practicing of not quite aging flour, but a little bit of drying out grain, before and after it was milled. But when you get into the specifics of it, you really wanted to use flour, even though it was not typical to use it as fresh as possible back then. Like, we think it's such a great thing to use things as fresh as possible. I mean, some of these things could have been sitting in bags and barrels for months And even
Getting
going,
nice and ripe.
yeah, even going rancid, and bugs was a giant problem with flour back then and grain. So aging, I don't think more of aging as the fact that it was just sitting around until somebody got to it. And I don't think there wasn't, it just depend on when you got it. If you had it milled, the day before, you might be using it the next day. And it might be as fresh as you can make it back then anyways.
Good question. Thank you for answering that. All right, Cynthia Miller says, hello, when the Lees, 18th century Lees, had guests to visit for a lengthy, a short stay, did the mistress of the house consult the guests before they visited concerning food and meal preferences? As far as I know, I have not seen any records to this, but I guarantee if you're inviting some important person to your house, you're probably going to have talked about the things that they like to serve at their house, and there's probably a pretty common understanding of what was going to be eaten. We think of, 21st century picky eaters. That was not necessarily part of the culture back then. There were no hardcore, stage 3 vegans and the whole bit. I think people were more appreciative of food during that period than they are now. Did you want to add anything to that, Justin?
No, I think that pretty much nails it.
So there's your answer there, Miss Cynthia. Thank you for zooming in again. Okay, Kathy asks, Justin, can you tell me how much cream and how many eggs go into that apple dish you made? I really want to try this. It was so good, by the way. And I love that you said that it was an egg dish on an apple dish, because it really did have texture and the sort of flavor and all of that of like a quiche that had apples in it.
Yeah, it's more of almost like it's not quite a savory dish, but at the same time, it's not a dessert either. It's something that would have been enjoyed like during the meal. If it's like the a la Francais style, like, everything comes out at once with various sides and whatnot, that might have hit the table towards the end. So not quite a dessert, but not quite a savory dish as well. A little bit of best of both worlds.
That's my favorite kind of dessert. Like, I don't like really sweet things. Like, I'm a savory person, a sour person, a bitter person, a spicy person. Sugar is nice, but it needs to have some balance. And that dish was absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
And the recipe,
Sorry.
we can I can actually get those to you, and we can send them out in the next few days.
Yeah, we'll get it to everybody. And I'm seeing more questions here. So we will get the recipes to you. We promise. All right, so Neil asks, okay, butter and lard mixed and used as a spread. This is something I have not heard of before. Please explain why and where. Is this a Southern colonies 18th century thing?
Well, 18th century, and the fact, if you look at not wasting any products, they're using every single thing. Whether it would have been that application, exactly, nobody knows quite for sure, but lard and beef fat and all those things were definitely used. And as far as butter, the Dutch used that on the spreading of waffles in New York, like I talked about in the video a little bit. Fine sugar, like more of like a cane sugar, a sifted cane sugar on top of those with butter. And that was a practice as well in Europe.
So good. All right, thank you. And then Stephen asks, what was that settlement called again?
Okay, sure. So if you're looking for information on it, it's called New Ebenezer, and it's in Georgia, close to a town called Rincon. So it's about 30 miles northwest of Savannah. And the group was called the Salzburgers. If you read anything about them, because they were so close to the Germany and Austria, that sort of area, they were known as the Salzburgers. And they have a great research library there if you ever do research or get down that way.
Research libraries are the best. Awesome. All right, Sarah asks, what sort of clay was used to create the kiln? Did Justin use a specific type of temper in the clay?
So there's a little bit of red clay from South Carolina, because it's mobile and it has to move and kind of obstruct a lot of modern day things. It has to be mixed with a little bit of quick mortar and lime. But it was cured. It took about 3 weeks to cure it. because there was so much humidity in South Carolina and I think when I was tempering, it was like, I think it was the winter, but it was still 80–90% humidity here. So it took 3 weeks to kind of dry everything out.
I bet. Lacey says, how big would an oven be at plantation site like Stratford Hall? So the oven at Stratford, we have a very large hearth at Stratford Hall. The little bake oven is fairly normal sized. It's not that large. The entrance way is maybe like a 2x2 sort of like hole, and then it opens up to sort of maybe a little smaller than your bake oven. But your research has shown you too that at several of the surrounding plantations, there was one site that was baking a lot of bread, right?
Yeah. So if you look at Robert Carter's like Nominee Hall.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, there was a merchant mill close to that he owned, and they had two ovens there that were firing 100 loaves per fire, which is actually the amount of bread that
I think it's like collection.
it as well.
I hope that was heard. So I think my internet got a little spotty, but I hope everybody heard what you said. If not, we can figure that out later. But I think that was my side that got a little glitchy. All right, Douglas writes, I have been attempting to bake authentic type of food for our Thanksgiving. That's awesome. I have attempted baking pumpkin bread and zucchini bread several times. Each time I always having the top center of the bread collapsing. Any suggestion as to how to keep the bread perfect? So how do you keep the middle of the bread turning into a nasty, dense puddle of raw dough?
So if you're talking about doing pumpkin bread and zucchini bread, like baking it in a loaf pan, a lot of the time they were actually what you need to do is the pan is almost too big and it's probably not even hot enough. Sometimes you need to preheat those. Just the same thing like when you're making like a cornbread. You want that pan and surface to be buttered and heated up with a little bit of fat. So, you know, when that batter hits it, when that dough hits it, it like sizzles a little bit.
Sizzle.
And that'll cause it to rise. That'll actually make it rise up a little bit farther in the center, and it should keep it from falling towards the end, because that is like a common problem. Like it'll rise up, and then sometimes like that too, if there's eggs in that bread, there might be too many eggs because it's like pushing it up and it'll fall just like a souffle.
This is why I don't bake. This is why I like to eat other people's food that they bake, because yeah, not that kind of cook. That's awesome. All right, Susan just wants a little clarification. She's like, were the reference that you made to the Lutherans actually Moravians who were in Georgia in 1735?
No, these were exiled Lutherans from the Salzburg area. Moravians, if you check out like the chronicles of Moravians that left Pennsylvania down into North Carolina, which created settlements like Winston-Salem and Wachovia. Those were a little bit later. And these were sponsored by England. So England was actually trying in one way to get another group of people other than Oglethorpe's to see and test the waters with silk and grain and see where they could make money. And it wasn't really, at one point they were trying to help them out, and the other point they were saying, hey, how can we get more money off of these colonies if we sponsor this group, and can we grow grain? Which they actually had to move the settlement after the first few years because they couldn't grow grain at all.
Oh, wow.
They were buying grain and bringing grain in to grind at their grist mill because they just didn't have good luck with it. But it's a very interesting thing because right across the river in South Carolina is Purriesburg, which is a big Swedish settlement. So on one you have Austrians, and on the other side you have Swedish, and it's just a really interesting story on how they kind of work together to really influence the grain trade in the South.
That's so fascinating. And, I think that, we all need to sort of have a better understanding that, British North America wasn't just a bunch of Brits. There were a bunch of other,
Exactly.
ethnic groups coming in here and very much influencing the fabric of our culinary history. So awesome answer. Thank you. Yes, I agree. Elizabeth asks, and I wanted to steal your waffle iron. I'm not kidding. Where did you get it? Because I totally want one. I agree 100%, Elizabeth.
So I have two of them. One's from the 1750s, the other one's from the 1780s. Both of them I got through cast iron dealers that mainly handle antiquities and cast iron. And they're quite common. I mean, in New England, you find them a lot just because they were so prominent in New York and Connecticut and Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, those areas. You always find either a wafer, which is the thinner mold, almost looks like an Italian pizzelle, or the waffle ones. But yeah, they're absolutely great. I mean, I've actually used them inside on an electric stove to test it before I had my actual oven, and they work. It gets a little messy, but they work.
That's awesome. And before we get off of the waffle topic, because you said something that I've become completely obsessed with, you talked about a waffle frolic. So I personally want to attend waffle frolics. I want to host waffle frolics. I think everyone should be having waffle frolics throughout the world. Can you talk a little bit before we get on to other things about lard and yeast and all these things? Like, let's talk for a second, Justin. Give us some more juicy details about these waffle frolics.
Yeah, so they actually found a couple advertisements. I think one was actually in for a college organization. It was a social gathering. It was kind of like the modern day like like a red cup drinking party, except you were and I think what it was to establish an elite status. And hey, look at me, I can have all these nice things. And whether people were actually participating or somebody else, that's kind of, I don't know, it's not quite documented that well. But to see that most of these happened up in New England and New York makes me think that, yeah, maybe people were actually participating in these, and these would be in a more standard like a standard upscale fireplace, not so much by a kitchen room or a hearth. I think maybe like an entertaining,
like a ballroom kind of thing where you're,
place. And because there is, some interesting things when you look at some holders that held kettles back then. You can actually see on some of these iron grates, and some of them are brass, so they're soft, and you can see indentations of where things were. So I think that's something that it's kind of untapped, to look at those and see if you can see the lines of waffle makers on there, see if they make an indentation, because it seems like, you don't need a lot of heat once they're hot. It's like any cast iron. Once it gets super hot, I mean, you could make 30 waffles without actually touching the flame again.
Right. Super interesting. Okay, Linda says or asks, you mentioned you were brushing the butter lard mixture on the waffles. What was the ratio of butter to lard?
I like to use like a 50-50 mix of lard, just because, butter, like anything, it was available, but it was also expensive. I mean, you would have had animal fat before you would have had actual butter. And a good thing that I was just actually talking last night on a Mount Vernon live stream, that plantations, it's a common fallacy that they were self-sustaining, because they had to import a lot of things before the revolution. And I think people think, oh, you have this, you have that, you can just use it. No, they had to make a living off of that, because they had to afford everything and everybody that was doing the work. So, when Washington says, it's pretty funny quote, and he says, I have 101 cows, but I have to buy butter for my family. So I think his question was, is somebody making off or stealing it, or are my cows just not producing anything? Why does it struggle so hard?
That's a great quote. Thank you for that. All right. Cynthia Miller says, hello. When guests visited Stratford, did they bring cooks or other servants with them? I was thinking that perhaps some did, but if so, did the cooks come along with the guests to help cooks at Stratford with the meal preparation? Thank you. So I can go ahead and answer this one. I have not read a lot of evidence of that at Stratford in particular, but through my own work for my book, I definitely found a lot of evidence of the larger gatherings, the barbecues, the fish fries. They would bring their enslaved cooks with them. But if you were just going to visit the Lees for a week, you might bring somebody, if you're the Carters or whomever, you might bring a nursemaid or a footman or those kinds of folks. But typically the cook then would have to sort of step it up and do more work on site. But you would see that sometimes happening. Absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia. All right, so from Neil, most of the items you cooked would have been actually cooked at the hearth, not in the oven. Yes. Question mark.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So, it just kind of depends on where you were and what you were doing. But most of the time, breads and buns, those would have been baked in the side hearth next, or the side oven next to the actual hearth in the kitchen. For my purposes, since I'm demonstrating and educating people outside of the actual hearth, most of the things I do are bread and are bread related. Most of those ovens were used for 90% bread and biscuits. The other 10%, would have been meats and such like that. But specifically, I think those things, just to demonstrate on a larger scale, those things coming out of the oven, how they would have cooked them. If that kind of answers your question, most of them would have been done in a hearth, like down hearth style, and or in the side bake oven.
Lake Stratford has a side bake oven too. Thank you for that question. Christina asks, can you talk some more about that old-fashioned yeast? Where does it come from? Do you need anything special before using it? Can it be found anywhere today?
Yes, you can find it today. And today, the closest thing that we can come to it without actually going to a brewery and getting the actual barm, which is the foam that rises to the top of the beer. And usually that's scraped aside and dried, and you can use that just like yeast. But for a modern look on that, I use ale yeast. And my ale yeast that I use is imported from England. So it's an English ale yeast. They do make some that are in the States today. And I think that's the closest thing that you're going to come, unless you also happen to brew beer at home. And that little foam.
And then you're a happy person because you have beer and biscuits all at your fingertips.
You can scrape that, and you can use that fresh, as long as it's kept in a fridge and heat doesn't kill it.
Great question. Susie asks, were cooks generally women or men? So I can speak to enslaved cooks. The predominant sort of percentage in the earlier days of the colony, it was enslaved African men. It moved then to not mostly women, but a nice balance of the two. And then do you want to speak on behalf of white colonial dudes, bacon, cooking?
As for speaking for like a commercial bakery or a baking firm, most of those were men, which is crazy, because when you compare it to some industries like brewing and distilling, a lot of distillers and brewers were women. So and those relationships between bakers and brewers and distillers was always quite good, because that's where the barm came from.
Right.
So you had to know some brewers to do that. But yeah, most of them that I've come across were men. Just a quick example of how many in one sort of town setting. Alexandria, by 1820, there's 65 bakers.
Wow, in Alexandria, huh?
Yeah, and they were quite prominent just because of how many mills were around that region and area, because some of them were even getting flours as far south as like Norfolk. So
oh wow,
they were bringing in flour from all over Virginia just so they could bake. And it was also, Alexandria was one of the first places to have steam injected ovens in the United States.
it's pretty fancy.
Yeah.
So were they then would it go inland to the colony or would it go out? Like how much of it went out versus staying domestically? Do you
So
know?
majority of it went out. There was bakeries in Alexandria that they were shipping biscuits to Queen Victoria. That's
That
how
is crazy.
that's how kind of crazy it is. And it was actually a um, inherited bakery of a baker during the late 18th century. And then during the 19th century, his son wound up baking biscuits exclusively for, Queen Victoria, which is
What a
wild.
job. That's
Yeah.
pretty amazing. That's so cool. So cool.
Yeah, but most of it was outside of the area, even though they were getting all the flour, most of the flour from Virginia.
Yeah.
The biscuits and bread that they were producing wasn't really staying in Virginia.
Okay. So interesting. All right. Kiri says, since you take the oven on the road, did you add anything for added strength to reduce the clay from cracking? Good question.
Yeah, there's a little bit of mortar in there. There's a little bit of mortar and lime. And like I said, there's a frame, a fire brick frame form underneath all that clay that's holding everything stable. You're not going to be able to see it, and you're also not going to be able to see the reinforced stuff that's underneath the oven because it's hidden pretty well on purpose. So yeah, there's a lot of structure. It's seen some cracks, and most of those are heat related. Most of those are not even road related. They're from long temperatures, and it's been in snow and rain and sleet and hail. It's pretty much been in everything. High winds and
That's so cool. Yeah, your oven's amazing. All right, Karen asks, when would this type of breakfast be served? Was it more of a special occasion situation? Would all of these typically be served together? So yeah, just talk about a typical breakfast during the colonial era.
Yeah, so the breakfast cakes, yeah, that's specifically a breakfast food. Now, when we get into like the tansy, like I said, that's more of a dinner item. So you're looking at like 2, 3 o'clock. You're not really looking quite at supper where sliced like butchered meats and roasted meats, which would be served for breakfast the next day to go along with those breakfast. Because you would actually, with no refrigeration, you'd be looking at eating the same thing that you ate for dinner or supper later the next day for breakfast. Because nothing really went to waste. So the night before it might have been roasted beef or boiled leg of pork, and the next day it was sliced butcher meats, pretty much the first meats of the states and colonies.
It's getting me hungry. That ham you had was phenomenal. All right, Cynthia Miller asks, I am very intrigued by the apple dish that you made towards the end of your video. It looks delicious, and it was. I may have missed it, but what type of apples were in that dish? What was the dish made? I'm sorry. What was that dish made with specific apples? Were those grown on the property? How many types of apples were grown? I'm thinking of Jefferson and his many apple types. Jefferson is this exceptional dude that like went all out on everything. I'm not sure if the Lees did the same. Thanks. So yeah, the Lees definitely had an orchard, but Jefferson had his own obsession with all of this. But go ahead, Justin.
Yeah. The Lees definitely had a few orchards on their property for sure. And as far as Jefferson, he was in the 30s and 40s of apples. And the same with like Washington. He was up in the 15s and the 20s of varieties of apples. Those apples that I was using specifically, those were Albemarle Pippins that I procured on a trip a year before, and made the apple butter not knowing that I would actually be at Stratford Hall.
That is crazy, really?
Using that same recipe.
Destiny, Justin. You had to come and rub that Richard Henry Lee butter at Stratford Hall.
It's weird because I had like one jar of it left.
No way.
It had been sitting. I'm like, man, I should probably use that for something. And then it came up, and but yeah, those are Pippins. That recipe is very interesting because it's taken through time. You'll find it The recipe that I used is from that 1730 E. Smith book, and that was published in Williamsburg as well in 1742. But if you take it back a little bit earlier in the 1670s, there was a French version of that recipe that came out, and it's pretty similar. It's, somewhat, they're boiling the apples instead of frying them. They're boiling them the first, and then they're layering them, sort of like they're coating them in a batter, then frying them again. And then you also see that in the Penn family cookbook too, which was in the late 1690s. So you see a bunch of different versions of that, even a manuscript version of Martha Washington's Book of Cookery. That's in there as well. And some of the books and manuscripts actually say, use pippins. That was a favorite apple of the English. It was an English variety. I know Ben Franklin for sure loved that variety of apple. And Jefferson and Washington did as well. It made excellent cider. And the fact that the apple butter, if we can kind of switch gears into that, the apple butter is so simple that's in that memorandum book. And it's one of the earliest things that I've ever seen actually labeled apple butter, because you see a lot in Moravian and Pennsylvania Dutch. You see it labeled as black butter, just because
interesting.
of the color that it's when oxidizing.
Right.
But you actually see it say apple butter, and it's cooked in new cider, which means it's freshly pressed.
Right, not alcoholic yet.
Yep, and the only additional spice other than a touch of like sugar is allspice. That's it. There's no, nowadays you look, people put cinnamon, nutmeg,
tons of stuff. Yeah, but it was such a beautiful, clean flavor. It was so nice. You could actually taste the apple and it wasn't overwhelmed by the spices. I thought it was fantastic.
Awesome.
It's really good. Douglas says, thanks so much, Justin. I can echo that. So yes, thank you, Doug, for thanking him with us all. Sherry asks, do you always keep coals/fire going in the oven? Do you use a door, and when?
The only time I use coals in the oven, actually, if I switch that in reverse and say, the only time I don't use coals in the oven is for bread. Now everything is taken out, that oven's cleaned out, swept, mopped, everything's raked out, put to the side, so I can refire it later. But you're only using residual heat for that bread. The coals itself are way too hot to actually do that. Now, if you're doing something like the waffles, it requires almost like that hearth cooking style where you rake some coals up underneath a hot iron plate or a iron griddle where you can set it on. That's more of that style of cooking. But yeah, that's pretty much the only time I would use coals, is like for the waffles and the tansey. Even if you're doing meat as well, using those kind of ovens, if you look at it from a progressive style, so, you would start out with like meats, and then maybe you would do pies, and then you would do bread, and then you'd end on anything with sugar in it because it would just burn if it was too hot.
That makes sense.
But yeah.
Cool. Jan asks, I love this question, are you planning to compile this discussion with photographs and recipes into a Colonial Foodways book? I think it would be fabulous. So do I. So yeah, Justin, we'll have to talk.
Yeah, for sure.
Why not? I'm all about working with people that are awesome, producing really cool stuff. So right on. Carly says, if the ovens are made of locally accessible clays and sands, why didn't each kitchen have one? Good question.
So if you're talking about like kitchen buildings that contain the hearth and those little side bake ovens, even, if you get into Pennsylvania and New York and Delaware, and they have like the squirrel tail ovens that are outside, but you can physically see the inside of them. More than likely, those are built of brick, the same bricks that were used to build the hearth. So the clay itself, if you're making mortar, which was quite common to make lime and mortar back then, especially for brickwork inside of kitchens, you're just going to finish the whole entire thing with brick. You might use the outside, might be coated in clay or a little bit of like plaster of Paris or bits of, chunked up bricks, and combined with water and a little bit of lime, and you'd form that outside. But more often enough, if you're making that hearth, the oven that you're going to make is also going to be brick. Brick ovens outside didn't become a thing until like the 1770s, like right before the revolution. You see that a lot in outdoor commercial baking ovens. Clay were kind of a previous form of that.
Good question. Cynthia Miller asks, waffle frolics again. Were waffle frolics so awesome? I totally agree with you, Cynthia. Turtle feasts and barbecues held outside, or were the former two held more inside? I heard a reference to a ballroom in regard to the waffle feast. Thanks. I know barbecues were typically held outside from what I've read in all of the diaries I've read and the letters. They were definitely something that you would do, on the river at night, sort of, in the summertime. But do you want to add to that, Justin?
Yeah, barbecues, any barbecues that I wrote about, they're all outside by either a creek or a river, some sort of open field that the setting is large enough.
Yeah.
They can have large scales of people, definitely outside dining preparations for food and drink. Now, like
feasting.
Like turtle feasts and waffles, that I think that was more of an inside kind of thing, maybe a little bit more of a tight knit gathering. The turtle feasts usually were some businesses would meet, or companies or societies would meet and have those. The waffles, the same kind of deal. I think it was just an elite status symbol, and let me get my closest tight friends, and we can make some waffles, eat some turtles.
Plus, like, just imagine, a lot of space outside means a lot of meat, and turtles aren't the most meat yielding animals out there.
No, not.
Not a lot of bang for your buck. Linda says, thank you. And thank you for zooming in. Linda also says, I love historical foodways. I think Justin and I agree. Go historical foodways, folks. Absolutely. All right. Cynthia says, I love the George Washington butter quote. I agree. Do you have the source of that? I wondered if that's in a letter. I would love to read the full letter. Thank you. So if you want to, you can answer that right now, or we can include that in the recipes that we send out to all the attendees, like in the next few days.
Yeah, I'll include that in the recipes, but it is in a letter from Washington, and it's kind of a direct quote, so we can get that together with the recipes in the next week or so, and we'll get those out to y'all.
Fantastic. Michelle asks, would it be common to have an oven next to the hearth and also a clay/beehive oven outside? Or would it be one or the other?
I think the problem with outside big ovens that were kind of common on large scale plantations, the thing is most of them didn't survive. And archaeological, I've talked to quite a few people, and it's very hard to find. See a very big ash pile surrounded by a foundation.
Like something burned there. We don't know what it was.
So, unless it was like physically inside of a building, which Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, those mid-Atlantic states were more likely to survive than the South, because, when you realize that not only is there, harsh weather of either aspect, but most of these places were not inland so far. They were by, a river, by a coast, and, with no knowledge of hurricanes coming back then as well, an oven could be wiped out and you could have never known it was actually there. So I think it's actually more likely that they had a small bake oven next to the hearth. The big style clay ovens were more communal, which you see in Virginia companies layout, like early 17th century. You see like community ovens like that. Also, you see bigger ones on military fortifications as early as King George's War all the way up through the Revolution, when you start to see traveling ovens with the Continental Army, which wasn't quite a thing. It was a cool idea, but it didn't really last as long as what they think, because they were made of sheet iron. And then you start to see people's homes, like smaller clome ovens, which there's one actually by Jamestown that was part of a North Devon pottery that produced these 3-part clome ovens. And they were found quite frequently. Actually, there was a lot of shards found not too far away from Stratford Hall at Pope's Creek, where John Washington's property was. And that's like some of the largest amounts were found there. They found 300 pieces of North Devon pottery. So some of that might have been from an actual small clome oven just to feed that immediate family. It wasn't baking on a commercial scale or anything.
Awesome question. I think I might have deleted one. I saw one a little bit ago and I can't find it here, but I know somebody asked specifically if the enslaved cooks were they also doing all the baking, or was there a separate baker? It just depended on the plantation. So when I was doing my preliminary research for my dissertation that turned into my book, I really focused on ones that were enslaved cooks that were labeled as just cooks, but I saw so many advertisements for enslaved bakers. So I think depending on the taste of the planter and sort of like their location and what they were trying to produce, it just depended on that. But sometimes, the enslaved cook would also do the baking, but on a larger, more sort of, different kinds of plantations, you're going to have different kinds of roles there. And some definitely focused on the baking part of it. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking again about like the commercial aspect of it, like merchant mills, those were definitely enslaved bakers because the amount of bread that they were producing per day. I mean, you're looking at 400 to 500 loaves of bread
That's
per
insane.
day. I mean, I might do like 100 and it's like, man, I'm like spent.
You're done, right? Yeah.
So, 400 to 500 loaves, or, maybe you're talking about 5,000 pounds of biscuits per day. So that's, that's just, it's super intense labor that really requires a physical presence.
Yeah. And Pat, this is sort of related. How often did bread get baked daily or no? I know at, Stratford and other plantations I've looked at, people were eating biscuits and bread pretty much every day. You could eat it a day or so afterwards, but I think that oven was always on. So, it was one of those things where the hearth is going, so the bread's going to be coming out pretty regularly. Did you want to add anything to that, Justin?
Yeah, I think it really depended on the household, how many people you're actually feeding. Sometimes you see like 3 days or 4 days per week because they're going to eat the same bread if they didn't finish from the day before, but they're also there's no switch on the oven back then.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the fire's going. You might as well just throw some more biscuits in, right?
Yeah, it's on. So, you might as well use it and not waste the wood.
Yeah, no, definitely. Douglas asks, Kelly, how many cooks do the Leaves have at Stratford? It's a 2-part question. I'll go ahead and answer that, and then I will give you the second part, Justin. That's for you. So the records that we have, like one cook per period that we know of, but I know for a fact that, for the Lees, they were entertaining so many people so frequently that I guarantee that the one cook, for instance, there was Richard Minette in the early years, and later during the Revolutionary War period, there was a man named Caesar who was the enslaved cook, and there were others afterwards, but there was typically one main cook and a lot of assistants. And so, Caesar had that title of being the cook, but they were definitely people that were making several of the dishes and doing the prep that were equally, sort of contributing to that dining room table, but didn't have that actual status. The second part of this question, Justin, is for you. Justin, have you ever cooked at Fort Frederick reenactments and Williamsburg?
Williamsburg, no. Fort Frederick, that was actually my family's first ever living history reenactment.
Was it? I love it.
We quite frequented there. And then with Half Crown Bakehouse, my oven that I travel with, I do the Fort Frederick Market Fair every year, with the exception of this past year and maybe not this upcoming year as well. But I always usually do that Fort Frederick Market Fair. It always receives quite a good crowd of 18th century artisans and whatnot. So.
I bet. Sounds amazing. Doreen asks, do the enslaved cooks decide the menu on a daily basis, or are they given the menu by the ladies of the house? It was a mixture, and it was depending on, not to give you like a wish-washy answer, but the fact of the matter is dependent on the lady of the house, the plantation, sort of the personality of each of them. But there was definitely conversations happening, and I think depending on the cook, depending on the mistress of the house, their personalities, their control, one was definitely probably making those choices more than the other, but there's no easy answer to that one. So sorry for that ambiguous response. Adrian says, are there any ingredients that you can't find, when making these types of foods? So like, what can you not find, Justin, when you're trying to like really recreate this 18th century feast? Like, what can you not find in 2020? Well, 19, let's not say this year.
I think the hardest thing to find is, when I actually find a variety of grain to bake or even to cook with, a variety of corn or wheat, or even as far as, like vegetables and peas. I mean, some of these things people just stopped, either they stopped growing and didn't seed save, or they've gotten bred into something totally different. And the hard thing about recreating and readapting that wheat is that, in the 1780s and 90s, a lot of that wheat got crossbred in the 1770s because nobody was home. They were all off fighting in the Revolution. And Washington, this was a big problem because when he got back, like all his stuff was like, crossed, and it didn't make much sense. So, and in the 1790s, you have, the introduction of like the Hessian fly, which just ruined wheat crops. And then you saw the rise of buckwheat and barley and just things like that. But I think if somebody mentions something specific, like a grain or like a pea, like, oh, there's these, Richard Henry Lee actually grew a lot of peas that he named after the places that he got them, or after the farmers that he got them. So, it's like, well, is this pea or is it this pea? Because he named it this thing. But I don't know what exactly that is because, nobody drew a picture or wrote a description of what it was like. If anything, vegetables and grains are probably the only thing that it's tough because, if people didn't seed save and, sort of regrow these things and reintroduce them, it's tough to find them in modern day because, a lot of things you can, rose water is actually, when people see that in the 18th century recipe, it's actually very easy to find. Now, whether that's the way it tasted, rose water, which you can find at international stores like crazy, but, the distillation of it, is that actually the same thing as if, they were doing it? And the same thing goes with liquor. Liquor probably didn't taste really that great. From the things we make today, because it was unaged, and two, they were just trying to get it out the door as quick as possible and sell, and they were trying to use up that grain. So to get things to taste the way they used to, it's hard to say because I didn't live back then, and all we can do is kind of take how people wrote about things, and unfortunately, a lot of the people that could write things down weren't the best descriptors of things. Really weren't the best keepers of things. So that's another problem.
Great answer. Pat Knock. Hello, Pat. Do you have a schedule of where you will be next year, a website?
I do have a website. It's www.halfcrownbakehouse.com. The schedule for this year and next year is kind of like up in the air for sure. But I will tell you that this upcoming weekend after Thanksgiving, I will be at Mount Vernon. They have an event called Winter Glow. There's 3 or 4 different 18th century artisans, vendors, and they'll be like illuminating the mansion. And it's a nighttime event, separately ticketed, that I'll be at.
Sounds great.
Yeah, this upcoming weekend, and then 2 weekends from them, and then probably some things with Stratford as well.
Oh yeah. We're going to get you back. We're going to get you back for sure. Thank you for asking. Cynthia Miller. Hi, this is not particularly related to food itself, but to these feasts and barbecues. What was the style of dress worn to the frolics, feasts, and barbecues? Thanks. I don't know I can't think of references to them, but
yeah, it's just, I'm kind of the same way because there is documentations of all these, feasts and frolics and outdoor barbecues. A lot of them took place at different times of the year. So obviously you're adjusting to the weather, but Also, you know, if it was a gathering, I guess it depended on, you know, was it a networking gathering? Was it just to be social?
Mhm.
Was it somebody you wanted to show up, you know, and kind of go all out? I guess it just depends on the actual style of the event itself.
Mhm. No, I agree. And you didn't have a ton of clothes. I think our wardrobe in 2020 is very different than a couple of outfits that even the most wealthy would have had to sort of wear to these kinds of things. So great question. Andrea says the site that I volunteer at just had a small clay oven built. Do you have any words of wisdom for new clay oven bakers?
Use it a lot and use it often. The only way that you're going to get practice and kind of develop a nice rhythm with your oven is to work it all the time. It's just, it's pretty much like it's a marriage. It's, you know, I'm married to my wife, but I'm also married to my oven.
To that oven, yeah.
Because, you know, that oven, you're at the oven's mercy. I want to say that you have, you know, little or no control other than starting the fire and taking the fire away. What happens
Yeah,
in the oven
that's
is
it, right?
up to the oven, and you just have to practice and practice and practice and really know your oven.
Great answer. We've got two more questions here. One's from Sherry. In a settlement or a small town, would there be a communal oven that was shared by residents to bake their individual items? That's a great question.
Yeah, so it kind of depended on where those settlements were. You know, I know in Virginia early on, the Virginia Company, part of their mandate or requirements were, you know, small communal ovens to share. And actually, you know, that goes back more into Europe than actually the colonies, uh, just because, you know, a lot of people think that that slash on the top of the bread is to release air, which it is. But usually most of those marks were made for different people in the community to identify their bread after it was baked.
So cool.
So it's like, oh, you know, this, you know, you see a lot of artisanal.
Yeah, how do you do
Well,
yours, Justin? Like a big J and a C?
you know, they do real thin slits or you know, skirts or S's or leaves
Yeah.
like modern day. And it's just like, you know, these were really meant to release air so it wouldn't puff out on the bottom, so it would be evenly baked, but also for identifying loaves. You know, and then when you get into commercial bakeries, usually there was a stamp on the bottom.
Mm.
And that would be the stamp of your baking firm because most cities or colonies had, you know, a sizing regulations and rules, which, you know, meant you could only sell the bread for a price that the flour was being sold at. So if they found out that your loaf was heavier for what you paid for wheat,
I
um,
love it.
they would actually fine you, and they would tell that by they'd lift open your bread and they would have that little stamp on the underside of
And you're guilty of not giving enough bread. I love it. Great question and great answer, Justin. All right, here is the last question of the night from Dawn. We are baking. This is perfect for our run up to Thanksgiving, which is why we scheduled this tonight, right, Justin? So Dawn asks, we are baking pumpkin pies this evening, so the house smells lovely, I bet, while listening to your presentation about delicious food. Is there an 18th century recipe for an apple cranberry dish? I would like to add historic food to our Thanksgiving celebration this year. Thank you. Anything you can think of? Throw some cranberry, some apple, and something.
I haven't quite come across anything specifically like cran apple, which that combination is highly 21st and 20th century. But because those things, you know, were quite common in New England. I mean, you even see Washington himself getting in cranberries from New England and apples, which are grown farther into the time than really anywhere else. I mean, you can have apples into December in New England, some of the older varieties. So I don't think it would be crazy to find something with those two things combined, especially something more savory and not so much sweet. And
Yes.
almost savory pies, because apples and turnips and even eggs and currants, they were all in those
Mm.
savory pies, which were quite famous around this holiday season, with Yorkshire and Christmas pies. And the combination of those things today, we think is rather a nice niche around the holidays. But back then it wasn't thought of that. It was just using what you had at the current time of the season. And seasonality was
Love it.
today it's cool. Back then it was surviving and living.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how we as a culture are now sort of trying to sort of force ourselves back to farm to table, which was like, I hate that phrase, by the way, but it's, that's kind of how everybody ate until recently. And also with the sort of seasonal, ingredients. I think it's really important. And then wonderful way to end it. Becky Childress, who's a longtime friend of Stratford and support us, is not a question, but this has been absolutely incredible. And I agree, Justin. I think that Justin should help cater the next in-person teacher institute at Stratford. I think Justin should come to Stratford once a month and make food. Yes. Okay, so before we wrap this up, Justin makes this butter. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I have been on a focused weight loss journey, but oh my goodness, your butter. Will you just talk about that butter for a second? Because I could literally eat that on everything all day, every day, forever.
Yeah, the butter, the butter is basically, it's a mix. It's a 50-50 mix of butter and lard, and then rendered salt pork, which, to starting out, it was a way to get people to understand rations of the French Indian War and the American Revolution, but making it in such a manner that was actually tasteful and not something that tasted horrible. So, combining things that, appeared on provisions and rations lists, like molasses, like lard, like butter, like salt pork, and combining those things with something that people would be given daily, such as, like a pound of bread. So combining all those things, not knowing that it would turn into something super delicious, it just, it kind of happened, and it's been kind of going strong ever since.
You need to just market that. I mean, it would be very bad for, I think, everyone to eat that all the time, but for an occasional treat, right? Like if you're really trying to just treat yourself, to have that salty, smoky, sweet butter on bread is phenomenal. So I want to thank you, Justin, for being a part of our series on colonial foodways and culture. I want to thank you for feeding me as you did this last summer. Looking at the video made me nostalgic for when you're on site. That means you will be coming back hopefully soon. And I want to thank everyone for zooming in. And I want to remind everyone that next Tuesday, this is a quick turnaround, December 1st, Justin Fornell will be back for his last time here for this season, because I think you all are going to come back, because I love you all dearly. The other Justin Fornell, will be coming back talking about the lees and liquor next week. And, just to also sort of reiterate that Stratford Hall has a very rich culinary history. And part of what I wanted to do when I started at Stratford a couple of years ago is to really bring that history to light. I think when people think about American food and colonial foodways, they think about Monticello. And that's appropriate. It makes sense. As you said, I mean, he had a million kinds of apples. He was doing all these things, but there were people like the Lees who were doing it long before Jefferson was even born. And I think it's important to sort of broaden that history of culinary fare, of culinary tastes, of that sort of historical sort of anchor in our nation into other plantation sites and other families that were here early, and to sort of, divvy it out to talk about the history of the enslaved and the history of all these beautiful foodways that you talked about tonight. So thank you, Justin, for your time, for your energy, for your knowledge, for your passion. And thank you all for zooming in. And I wish all of you a wonderful Thanksgiving. And just so everybody knows, the first Thanksgiving was not in Virginia. It was in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they ate eel and not turkey. So on that note, one day I'm going to eat lobster and eel for Thanksgiving and have an authentic feast. Right. So maybe you want to come up for that, Justin.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you all, and I will see you all next week. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Justin. You're amazing.